Now this morning we will be giving some attention to the prophecy of Micah. So if you have a Bible there, it'd be very good to have that open. And we will be looking in particular at some phrases from Micah chapter 6, but we will be going back and forth throughout Micah. And as well, we will have some reference to the other reading that we've taken today, which is from 1 Peter chapter 5, and you will have picked up, of course, in the reading from Micah chapter 6 and 1 Peter 5 verses 1 to 11, that there is a connection in theme, and both the readings today have at their heart something about the matter of humility. I've shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of thee? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And I urge you, says Peter, humble yourselves under the hand of the living God, that he might exalt you at the proper time. For as it is written, and there he quotes from one of the Proverbs, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And I thought at the close of this year and the beginning of the next year, Grant will be preaching next Sunday for our first Sunday of the new year, as we stand at the close of one and the threshold of another. It would be good just simply to ask this question: how is it that we can walk from the year that we've just had, and how can we walk into the year that we are about to have, where the Lord has in store for us all sorts of things that he's yet to reveal to us? And the answer very simply is, at all points we walk humbly with our God. But then something else came to me very strongly as I was thinking about this during the week, because our God walks very humbly with us. We don't have too much trouble with the first part of the sentence. Walk humbly with your God, because God is so big, so strong, so mighty, there is nothing that God cannot do, which is wrong. Poor theology. I would sometimes, as some of you may remember, I've said once before that I'd sometimes play a bit of a cruel trick, I suppose, on some of our students at the college, particularly some of the first ones just coming in, and we'd put on the board, I'd say to them, let's just put on the board the characteristics of God. And we would have a list. God is holy, God is mighty, God is eternal, God is all-seeing, God is all-knowing, God is transcendent, God is the Creator, God is the Lord of all things. And we'd look at all of that list and all the others that would go there, and I'd say at the end of all of that, actually, any pagan would say that about their God. Any person from any religious tradition would actually say all of those things about their God. That's why they worship their God. It's quite an astounding thought to us, I think, an astounding thought that God is humble. We'll come to that. The first thing that I think we need to bear in mind as we come to Micah is that the whole world wants to call God to account. Not long ago there was a crisis which took place in a particular rural community in our state here, and I heard one of our leading politicians, who will remain nameless at this point, and one of our leading politicians said, this community has been suffering the drought for 4 years, and now this has happened. And he went on to say, how unfair is that? The subtext of the plot was, do not fear, the government is here, and we're going to help make it fair. But that sort of statement, and much of what you hear coming through our media, and particularly those sort of what I call the moany-groany programs. You know, the moany-groanies that come on at about tea time, and they show you all the horrid behaviour of all of the really horrid people in the world. So while we're sitting and eating our tea, we can feel more self-righteous because we don't do the horrible things that all of those people do on their TV. But during those sort of moany-groany programs, the thing that is often and most often stirred up is the sense of unfairness, the sense of injustice, the sense that these things shouldn't happen to such nice people. And I guess we've got plenty of biblical examples of that sort of moany-groany anger. There's a little book over there somewhere that you'll find which far outweighs its size in terms of importance. It's called The Justice Men and the Great Rage. And I guess we've got plenty of biblical examples of the justice men in the Bible who are in great rage that God is not doing things in the way that he ought to do them. One of the prime examples perhaps would be Jonah, who was a justice man with a great rage, even though he was a prophet, which warns us all, doesn't it? And then you remember at various points the disciples were justice men in great rages. And at the end of all of that, there's this question constantly on their lips, what's going to become of us? And the question underneath that is, Lord, don't you care about us? Do you remember the time that Jesus was in the boat and he had his head on a pillow and he was asleep and the storm was raging, and they came and woke him and said, don't you care, Lord? And that's where we are when we're in our boats and we're getting tossed to and fro in the storms of life. We want to wake God up and say, don't you know what's going on? Don't you care? Aren't you watching? Aren't you hearing our prayers? So we've got plenty of personal examples, I think, not just in the scriptures but in our own life, our own experience, of having a dose of the moany-groanies, of being justice people with a great rage that things are not as they ought to be. And in that rage we will strike out in whatever way we can to make them the way we think they ought to be. And when we do that in the name of justice and fairness and rightness, we can overthrow governments, we can destroy whole societies, because it's just. And in the midst of all of that, it is remarkable, to me at least, and I hope you'd agree, it is remarkable that there should be anywhere on the earth a group of people who are not moany-groany people. That there should be even a remnant of God's people who are actually contented. It is absolutely astounding that God in his mercy and grace should see to it that somewhere on the earth, according to his own love and kindness, there should be people who walk humbly before their God. And if I was to ask you what would you say are the characteristics of humility, it's a bit hard perhaps to define those. There's a sense of contentedness, a peacefulness, a non-complaining spirit, a trustfulness. But very often we find it easier to define something by its opposite, and probably the best way to speak about what it is to be humble or to walk in humility is to say the opposite of that is pride in the scriptures. The opposite of being humble is being arrogant. And in the day of Micah, everyone, it seemed, in God's covenant community was walking in the pride and the arrogance of their own heart. Now, when pride and arrogance lodge in our hearts, they don't often reveal themselves just in those terms. The pride and arrogance that's tucked away in our hearts are revealed by other things. For example, the way in which we buy and use goods to make a statement, to somehow secure the things that we want to uphold before the world as giving us some sense of identity. Pride and arrogance also is in the fact that we are the people who do the right thing by God. And that pride and arrogance is also manifest very particularly in the way in which we feel that things come to us as being unfair, that things are not just. And the unfairness, when we feel that things are unfair, it's not just that something's happened, but underneath that there's this, that it should happen to me of all people. And we do carry around within us, I think, don't we, this sense that says, well, if God is God and if he is just, he really actually, like when there's a car accident, he should actually just take out the bad guys, the hoon drivers. Like if you live on a main road at 3 o'clock in the morning, have you ever been tempted to put piano wire between the trees across the road? Because God's not doing it? Or when there's sickness or disease or some calamity, or if a tower falls over and kills people, as in Luke chapter 13, we carry within us this sense that, well, God actually should direct the bricks so it only hits the bad guys. And there's a terrible assumption in that they're bad guys and we're good guys. To which Jesus says, unless you all likewise repent. So that sense of unfairness that we sometimes carry around within us, the moany, groany, hard, grumbly, discontented spirit that will not smile for the life of us, you know, there we find that at the core of that is pride. And all of those things about which we've spoken in various ways are evident in the book of Micah. And throughout Micah, God's people are wanting to call God to account. The context of Micah is that there are international upheavals taking place. The great nation Assyria is being raised up by God, sort of in a second resurrection, really, of its national history. And as Assyria is being raised up, so God is using them to bring judgment on the tribes in the north. He's using them to bring destruction to Samaria. And Micah looks in the middle of all of this. And he also, in the Spirit, is given a prophetic insight to the fact that 150 years or so after this, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, that God's people in Judah, in the southern kingdom, are going to be taken away into Babylon. And in the midst of all of these great upheavals and the sweeping judgments of God coming through and nations toppling over, he stands to proclaim God's plan and purpose to God's own people. And he doesn't really like doing that, because when he stands to proclaim, people don't like what he says. In chapter 2, verse 6, there's a particularly unusual phrase. It says in my translation, do not speak out. So this is the people saying to Micah, do not speak out. They speak out. So they speak out to Micah, do not speak out. But if they do not speak out concerning these things, reproaches will not be turned back. Verse 11, if a man walking after wind and falsehood had told lies and said, I will speak out to you concerning wine and liquor, he would be a speaker out, a spokesman for God's people. Now, that phrase, speak out, or spokesperson there, is often translated prophesy, but the word underneath that is very, very different. You may see a marginal translation, if you look in yours, that says, do not flow to us. And the idea is of some water running or dribbling or dripping, and some of the more creative translations say, do not drip on. Do not dribble. Do not speak drivel to us. So Micah's standing, proclaiming the plan and purpose of God in the midst of his people, and the people are sitting there saying, oh, Micah, don't dribble on. They dribble on to me, says Micah, don't dribble on. But, he says in verse 11, in the modern parlance, if you could have someone come who would give you a full day seminar on wine tasting, wine and strong liquor, they'd say, yes, we'll listen to him. He can be a spokesman for us. And the people at this point in Judah had been tested out by prosperity. Sometimes the Lord tests out his people through adversity. This time of the southern history of his people's kingdom, they were being tested out by prosperity, and that pride in their prosperity was manifest in greed. Have a look at a few verses. Chapter 2, verse 1. Woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil on their beds. When morning comes, they do it, for the power is in their hands. They covet fields, they seize them, they seize houses and take them away. They rob a man of his house and a man of his inheritance. Just go down to verse 8. Recently my people have arisen as an enemy. You strip the robe off the garment from the unsuspecting passer-by, from those who've returned from war. The women of my people you evict, each one from her pleasant house. From her children you take away my splendour forever, because God was the one who saw to it in Israel that the orphans and the widows would be provided for. And those who are in charge of God's people stripped them of their assets, and by stripping the widows and the orphans of their assets, he was saying, you're actually stripping away my splendour from them. It's not just a material asset, it's what was actually provided for them according to my law. Go across to chapter 3. Now the translations vary in all of these. You might be looking in yours and you'll have slightly different phrases, but you'll pick it up. I said, hear now, heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel. Is it not for you to know justice? You who hate good and love evil, who tear off their skin from them and the flesh from their bones, who eat the flesh of my people, who strip off their skin from them, who break their bones and chop them up for the pot as meat for the kettle. Then they will cry out to the Lord, but he will not answer them. Instead, he will hide his face from them at that time, because they've practiced evil deeds. What's he speaking about there? He's speaking about those who are shepherds of the sheep, who are now consuming the sheep, snipping them up into bits, using their fleeces, chomping them up. It's the same sort of language that's used in Ezekiel chapter 34. These are the shepherds, he says, against whom the Lord's anger rages, because they do not care for the flock. Instead, they feed themselves on the flock. Go down a little bit further to chapter 3, verse 9. Hear this, O heads of the house of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, who abhor justice, twisting everything that is straight. You build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with injustice. Her leaders pronounce judgment for a bribe. Her priests instruct for a price. Her prophets divine for money. Yet they lean on the Lord, saying, is not the Lord in our midst? Calamity will not come upon us. Now here, beloved, we're in great danger. We can hear this like you hear one of the moany groany programs at tea time on your TV. And you can hear this and say, oh, they are wicked, horrible people. I'm glad God's going to deal with them. I don't have any of those problems. And that's where we're in the most danger of not walking humbly with our God. As the prophecies of Micah unfold, you see that they are guilty of all sorts of practices, but they have one end: the idolatry, the sorcery, the offering of their children through the fire, all sorts of things. They have one end. It's the overweening pride of self-advancement, and the overweening pride that rests on the fact that they do the right thing by God. We've got a temple, we do the worship, we've got the priests, we've got everything tucked away in the temple just as it ought to be. We've got the Ark of the Covenant there. We do the right thing by God. He does the right thing by us. We provide the sacrifices. He provides the blessing. So as he's in our midst, what should we do? We should not listen to Micah, who drivels on. about judgment, who dribbles on about the fact that we'll be taken away into captivity. Micah doesn't know what we know. We've got God in a box, in a temple. Now, in response to all of that, Micah speaks as God's voice. Chapter 6. And God actually calls his people to account. Hear what the Lord is saying. Arise, plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear your voice. Listen, you mountains, to the indictment of the Lord. And you enduring foundations of the earth, because the Lord has a case against his people. Even with Israel he has a dispute. What's this language about calling to witness? You remember when the covenant was made with Moses on Mount Sinai, the whole of heaven and earth was called to witness the enactment of the covenant. Because if it had just been Moses as the witness, if it had just been someone who was alive at that day, there'd be no enduring proof that the covenant had been enacted on the terms that it had. And instead God calls us the creation itself. The whole of the creation is the witness to the fact that God has made this covenant with people. And so as now Micah's people stand as the breakers of the covenant, God comes to them and says, well, I call all of the witnesses, like the whole of the creation, I call that to bear witness about the covenant. And this is the witness, that in all that you are doing, you are not doing what that covenant said. I have shown you, O man, what is good. And what is good is this: to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. Now I want to speak just for a minute about those three verbs. To do justice, to love mercy or kindness, to walk humbly. To do justice. See, when we're in the moany, groany state, we're not doing justice. We are sitting there wanting justice to be done. What he's saying here is this: when you, as God's covenant people, deal with one another, deal justly with one another. Don't rob the orphans and the widows of their inheritance. Don't strip my splendour away from them. Deal justly with them, because they're your brothers and your sisters. Deal justly. Do it. Do justice. But if someone doesn't do justice to you, what do? Love mercy. Love kindness. If you only want to do justice by getting back at people, you're not loving mercy. Justice is what you do as the outflow. And when justice is not done to you, you love mercy as the outflow. So you do justice and you love mercy. And that fits everything back the way it ought to be. And you walk humbly. And it's not even walk humbly before your God, the great omnipotent power ruling over you. You walk humbly with your God. And that opens up to us one of the most astounding truths in the whole of the Scripture, that God walks with his people. Now that theme is a theme that's worthy of a long exposition, but you can go right back to Genesis and the creation, God walking in the midst of the creation with his people. You can follow it through God's provision for them in the Exodus, and God walking with them through the sea, God walking with them ahead of them through the wilderness, God walking with them in those 40 years. And there are statements in Leviticus chapter 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 23 where it speaks about them coming into the land and settling. And God says, in this land I am the God who walks with you in that land. I walk with you because my temple is there, the place where I've caused my name to dwell is there. So God's people are not the people simply who walk under God, but astounding, overwhelming grace. God's people are the people with whom God walks. And he walks as a shepherd amongst his people to attend his flock. So if someone does not do justly to you, you love mercy because the shepherd who's over them loves mercy. And he'll see to whatever justice needs to be done. Do not take your own vengeance, beloved. Leave room for the wrath of God. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So why should we walk humbly with God? 4 things very briefly. Firstly, as we've already said, God walks with us, beloved. He walks with us. We've got a couple of young people going away from here to study and work overseas. God walks with them. They go in the Father. We've got other people who are away even now from us. Some visiting their homelands. Some in the flow of the gospel. God walks with them. God walks with us. God walks with them. God is in the midst of his people. It's not just, beloved, if we could see it, it's not just that his throne is over us. His throne is in the midst of us. And from another point, we're in the midst of his throne. So God walks with us. Secondly, the God who walks with us walks according to his ways, not our ways. And you remember a week or so ago before Christmas, we talked about the God whose ways are not our ways and whose thoughts are not our thoughts. And this God is the one who walks in grace and mercy amongst his people. And you say, yes, where do you get that from Micah? Because all we've heard from Micah so far are the judgments. Because in Micah you find the most wonderful prophecies. Take, for example, chapter 4. It will come about in the last days that the mountains of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised up above the hills. All the peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come. They'll say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the God of the house of Jacob. That is the God of the house of these people who have got a complaint against him. The God of the house of these people whose overweening pride means that they must be brought to judgment. He's still their God. That he will teach us of his ways, that we may walk in his paths. From out of Zion will go forth the law. And he will judge between many peoples, and he will render decisions for mighty, distant nations. And they'll hammer their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation. Never again will they train for war. Each will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. Though all the peoples walk each in the name of his God, for us we walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever, whose ways are not our ways. Beloved, if he would mark your iniquity, who of us would stand this morning? The God who walks among us walks according to his ways, not our ways. And all he says is, walk according to my ways, not yours. And my ways are, I do justice, And when justice is not done to me, I love mercy. That's why I'm going to judge my people, because I love mercy, so that they'll come to see it. Go across, we could go to many, many places. Chapter 7, verse 18. Who is a God like you, who pardons iniquity, passes over the rebellious acts of the remnant of his possession? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in unchanging love, or loving kindness, hesed. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. Yes, you will cast all of their sins into the depths of the sea. You will give truth to Jacob. You'll give unchanging love to Abraham, which you swore to our forefathers from the days of old. Right in the middle of the most horrendous rebellion of God's people, there's a promise. A new covenant. Sins totally removed. Iniquities trampled underfoot, cast in the depths of the sea, washed away forever. So, with whom do we walk? We walk with the God who walks with us, and when he walks with us, he walks according to his ways, not our ways. You're not going to put him in a box, ever. So why do we walk humbly? Thirdly, fourthly, can't remember, I've lost count. Because, beloved, God does justice. Because God loves mercy. And because God walks humbly with us. You say, oh, I'm not sure about that last bit. Not sure I want a God who's just humble. Well, you think about the opposites of humility. Do you want a God who operates by the principle of his own pride? Do you want a God who operates according to his own arrogance? Beloved, you see the nature of the humble God in the person of Jesus Christ. I can't remember which English archbishop it was who said, God is like Christ, and in him is no un-Christ-likeness at all. God is like Christ, and in him is no un-Christ-likeness at all. To paraphrase Martin Luther, you have no other God except the one who nursed at Mary's breast. That's the way he is. He's not meek and lowly of heart temporarily until he goes back to being proud and arrogant again. He's meek and lowly of heart because that's the way God is. Son of Man did not come to be served, but to dominate with ruthless power and to exercise his arrogant pride. Modern 20th century translation. Did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. In Isaiah 57, there's a wonderful statement. For thus says the one who's high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, and with him who is of contrite and lowly spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly, to revive the heart of the contrite. There's a great mystery as to how it is that the fullness of God can dwell in the person of Jesus Christ. But one possible answer to how that can be is that Jesus was the most meek and humble man in the whole earth. And so the one who looks to dwell with the lowly and the contrite of heart could dwell with all his fullness in the person of Jesus, because in him the lowliness the humility, the contriteness, was full. As he walked in the Spirit given to him without measure, he did not cry out. He did not raise up his voice. He did not demand justice. But he loved mercy. Father, forgive them. Look, take the pressure off your kids. Stop beating them over the head with a Bible and just love them. Forgive them. And love being merciful to them. Never know what might happen. Take the pressure off one another. Take the pressure off the governments of the world where you somehow think that they have to be able to sort it all out. Beloved, they never will. They never can. In 1 Peter chapter 5, he says what? I urge you, as a fellow elder among you, submit yourselves not lording it over those allotted to your charge, proving to be example to the flock. When the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the crown of unfading glory. You young men, likewise subject yourselves to your elders, all of you, clothe yourself with humility towards one another. Don't let the moany groanies take up residence in your heart. For God is opposed to the proud. I'm not proud, I've just been hard done by. Tells its own story. I'm not proud, I just want to sort out the other people. God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at your proper time. Now, the next word in my translation is casting, part of a sentence, not the start of a new sentence. And the reason that it's a part of a sentence, a participle, is this: how do you humble yourself under the hand of God? By casting your anxieties upon him. Taking your anxieties to yourself and worrying about them is a sign of how proud we are in our spirits, that thinks we can manage them and do something about them, fix them. No, you can't. You do not humble yourself by trying to fix your problems. You humble yourself, casting your anxiety upon him. That action itself is the humbling. And in connection with that, he says it's in these things, we don't have time for this, that the serpent, the ancient one, the devil, who prowls around like a roaring lion, is actually overcome. In Psalm 91, you can read it later when you go home. The evil one comes to Jesus in the temptation in the wilderness, and he picks out a verse from Psalm 91 and he misquotes it to the Son of God. He says, if you cast yourself down, he will give his angels charge concerning you, and he will not let you stumble, and he will not let you fall. So do it. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. The whole of Psalm 91 is about the man who does not take things into his own hands, but trusts the Lord to take care of what needs to be taken care of. And to that one, it says, he will tread the scorpion and the serpent underfoot. So the serpent, the evil one, the devil, takes a verse out of context, as he always does, and says, Jesus, this is the way to prove that you're the Son of God. And Jesus knows Psalm 91, and he knows the God of whom Psalm 91 speaks. He says, no. The way to do that is actually exactly the opposite. to not do what you're saying, because what you would be saying would be a manifestation of arrogant pride in testing. So I just rest quietly under God's hand. He will give to me what's needed, and in so doing, Satan, I tread you underfoot. So it is for the Son of God. So it is for the Son of God on the cross. So it is for his people. Beloved, where have we come from? 2008. We've come from a year where God walks with us. Where are we heading? 2009. Same place. A year where God walks with us. And the God who walks with us is entirely humble. Not a shred of arrogance or pride in him. And he says, look, this is the way I walk. Why don't you walk the way I walk? The way I walk's best. I made it to be that way. So, beloved, let's let all of the other stuff go, shall we not? And we can look ahead in God to loving kindness, to doing justice, to walking humbly before him.